thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dan Kuntz, Director of Professional Development at the Missouri Society of CPAs, and I would like to welcome you to today's program. It's hard to believe it's the last Friday in May, but I hope that everybody has a good week and planned ahead. Now, a lot of people are curious on returning to work considerations regarding safety, risk, and policies. For instance, what is the latest guidance from the CDC regarding operations during COVID-19? Or what are the strategies for who returns to the office and when? What are clear policies and expectations for telecommuting? We hope that this session will provide you with a little insight to those questions and more. Now, Barbara Dunn and Doug Oldham are attorneys with the law firm of Barnes & Thornburg. Barbara has served as most CPA's counsel for many years and has been a trusted resource for us and many other tax-exempt organizations, both locally and nationwide. Barbara is currently helping us with our bylaws revision process. We thank her for her ongoing guidance. Barbara's colleague Doug, who graciously agreed to join us today, advises employers of all sizes on a broad range of fair employment and wage and our policies and practices. He has solid guidance for us to consider as we begin transitioning our staff back into the office. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Doug and Barbara.
Thank you so much, Dan. Good day, everyone. It's nice to be with you. First and foremost, I hope that you and your families are safe and well during this most challenging time for all of us, both personally and professionally. I've been pleased to get to work with so many of the members and with the good programs and work that Missouri CPA Society offers. And in this context, was delighted to have an opportunity to introduce you to my colleague, Doug Oldham, who is my right-hand go-to person on all things labor and employment. And fortunately, Doug was kind enough to indulge me and working with Jim O'Halloran and the staff as well on return to work plans. And so as we talked about this topic, it certainly was something that we know is top and center on many of your minds as you transition into the workplace. And so today we're really going to focus on some key aspects, and we'll make this informal as possible. We'd love to have a conversation with you. So definitely invite you to enter your questions into the chat box. We'll be taking a couple of pauses during the program, and then of course time at the end. Realizing everyone's in a different situation, we'll answer those questions as best we can and give guidance and recommendation, and also share with you a couple of sources of resource. So with that said, let me just introduce things which obviously, starting with the most somber of the facts that unfortunately in the United States, we are now over 100,000 deaths due to the pandemic. I think it's something that, as I say that right now, it gives me goosebumps, and those of you, and again, with the families of those that affected, to say the least. Many of you, like us in our firm, had to act very, very quickly to go remote and virtual. Many of us had little notice. Many employers were prepared, many weren't. So, there's been a big learning curve. I think we were chatting earlier about, using Zoom and other video conference technologies and some of the funny aspects that come with it. But, it's a learning curve, and I know you all are on that learning curve as well. We'll focus today specific to Missouri in your stay-at-home order, which was lifted was through in effect now into April and into May, and then obviously that being lifted and the implications of that. As growing up in St. Louis, knowing that Missouri borders lots of states, including Illinois and Kansas and Iowa and Arkansas, to name a few. We won't focus on those, but I think the principles that we'll talk about with regard to returning to work and staffing are really universal for all of those states. This recovery order is in place. As Dan said, I agree, it's kind of hard to believe we're at the last Friday in May. They will stay in place, a recovery order, until May 31st. And not telling you anything you don't know, but we are in uncharted territory. And you may hear us say we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, and it isn't that it's something that is that we should know. And you all know this, I know, in your own practices. We're living in unprecedented times, and we are in uncharted territory. So a lot of the decisions that you'll need to make as employers or working with your staff is really a bit of a common sense, but also, you know, some basis within the guidance that we are getting. And so we want to give you that good practical advice as we go through our session this morning. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Doug, to introduce the agenda. Doug?
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, we're going to talk about a few things today, everybody. We're going to look at what the next step for employers should be, thinking really short term as you're thinking about whether it's time to return people back to the office, how you can get your businesses back up and running again. We want to talk about how we can keep everybody safe in the process of doing so. So let's start off with a discussion of telecommuting. Right now, the safest thing you can do for your employees is probably to keep them at home if they're able to do their jobs there. You know, I understand not everybody can do their job from home, but if you have a job you can do from home, that's probably still your safest option. Obviously, you know, let's talk about how we do the logistics of telecommuting. First thing we need to do is figure out which employees realistically can work from home. If you look at everybody's job duties, some people are going to have to be there. Some people answer the phone and they're interacting with people who come to the office, and there's no other way that they can do those duties. You might have somebody who, you know, has other duties that requires them to actually be there. That's fine. But if you have employees who have productivity issues where they're just not able to get their work done at home, they have conduct problems where you really don't trust them to work from home, these may be other issues you look at. You may say, you know, I'm not comfortable with you telecommuting if we're able to get you back into the office. You know, that's not going to apply to everybody. If you have people who can sit at a computer and work remotely, they get their work done. Right now, that's generally the advice we're giving. If you can't keep them home, at least give it some serious consideration. Another thing you need to think about are the safety standards you have in place with people working from home. You're responsible for workplace injuries that happen at home. You know, you have OSHA concerns with working at home, workers' comp. Somebody can have an injury and it can happen in their own house, but if they're doing it while they're doing their job, you're still responsible for that. That's going to be a workers' comp issue. You want to maintain proper data security for people. You want to make sure that you have the encryption that you need for people to do their job without you know, getting hacked. You'd want to ideally have the same sort of data security that you have for people when they're working in the office. Now, assuming you're letting people work from home, you know, you want to develop some expectations for what people are supposed to do while they're there. You need to make sure that you have guidance for employees so that they know when they're supposed to be working and when they are working, what they're supposed to be doing. With some employees, you may expect them to do everything that they're doing, you know, from home, the same as they would do it in the office. With other people, you may have different expectations where they're not able to do all of their job functions. But you know, you should make that clear to people. You need to you know, set in place guidance about how productive people are, what sort of conduct rules they should follow. For example, you wouldn't want somebody violating your harassment and discrimination policies working from home. That's still going to apply, where they still can't make inappropriate comments to other coworkers, you know, send inappropriate pictures or things like that just because they're working remotely and not in your office. At the same time, though, I think this is a time where we want to be compassionate with employees. We want to maintain some flexibility. You can't be totally rigid with these standards because, you know, people are in a strange place right now. They're scared. Some people are grieving the loss of loved ones or just kind of adjusting to their new reality. Some people have kids or dogs or, you know, any number of factors that may limit their productivity, and to the extent you can, you want to try to be flexible with them. Understandably, you can only be flexible to a certain extent. You still have to count on people to get the work done. But if you can give people a little bit of leeway in doing that, that's generally a good policy to follow.
Doug, we got questions coming in. Thank you so much, and keep them coming in. Interesting question as to whether you would foresee any discrimination issues with allowing some employees to work from home while not allowing others to work from home due to productivity or conduct issues.
Sure. I think anytime you make decisions where you divide one group of employees from another, there's the possibility that somebody's going to claim it's discriminatory. I think anytime you are making distinctions between employees, it's important to think about why you're making those distinctions. If you have employees who are, who don't have a history of good productivity or, the sort of conduct you expect, hopefully that's something you've documented in the past, so you can bring that up and show examples of why you don't think that they're appropriate to work from home. That's a good reason why you should have clear standards in place for your expectations. I think, if you explain to all of your employees why they need to follow certain steps to be productive, there are going to be some employees who clearly don't meet those expectations and those standards, where it's easier to, point to those rules and those expectations and say, this is the reason you can't work from home, or this is the reason other people can work from home. And, that sort of provides a non-discriminatory reason for the decisions you're making.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And thanks, Doug, for that recommendation. It also leads me, as you mentioned earlier, about certain jobs being more conducive to working at home than others. Certainly, we always talk about the importance of job descriptions and having key components within those job descriptions. If you don't have those job descriptions now for your staff, this is a great opportunity to do that, because they can be a good, I'm gonna date myself and say yardstick. So remember those yardsticks for measuring performance and things like that. But would your recommendation be, Doug, that there may also be need to consider putting something in a job description as to whether that position could be a work at home position, or is that better done, as needed?
I think that could be a good idea, and that could be something that's useful even beyond the current COVID-19 situation. I think to the extent there are positions that need to be performed in person, it's a good idea to say so in the job description, because that's going to protect you in any number of situations when an employee claims that they need to work from home. And these scenarios have come up for years, even before this, where somebody claims they need to work from home for any number of reasons, and it really doesn't fit what they do for a living. And you may need them to interact closely with their coworkers, and that really just can't be done from home. Or you need them to have a physical presence to deal with clients or other outsiders. So it's a good idea, if somebody needs to be in the office, definitely to put that in the job description. And I think it's good to be very clear in your job descriptions what somebody's essential functions are, because it makes it easier to make those arguments.
That's great, thank you. And one last comment, I guess, I know we'll move on to the return to reopen. You had mentioned about the security, the data security, and as you know, within our firm, early in the virtual office, there was a reminder as to whether folks that have Amazon Alexas and other smart devices to not have those near their computers, as they may be listening or are listening. I found that to be something, again, a bit of a convenience for all of us in some way, but also a reminder that our workspace looks a little different now. So thanks, Doug. I know we're going to talk next about returning to work now and reopening.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. At some point you are going to want to get everybody back into the office, because even if it's not currently the absolute safest decision, it probably is in the long run the most productive way to move your business forward. And we're all sort of figuring out when to go back, how to go back, and there are a lot of questions with this. Luckily, Missouri law is not going to be overly restrictive in this. Unless you're operating a restaurant or a school or something along those lines, most of the remaining restrictions aren't going to apply to you. And even to the extent they do, most of those restrictions are expiring in the next couple of days. Just because you can reopen your office, you need to think about whether this is the right time to do so. Because if you're doing fine with everybody at home and you want to wait and see how things go before you send everybody back, I think that's a very safe and responsible choice. But some people can't wait. They need to get people back into the office. If not everybody, then at least some of their key people. So we want to take a look at what the safest steps are when you do start to reopen your offices. The first question we're going to ask is who comes back? Because not everybody has to come at once. Say you bring back a small percentage of people who really need to be there in person. Maybe you think about who those individuals would be. And as Barbara brought up, we need to make sure that we do that in a way that is non-discriminatory. We want to make sure that there's a valid basis for deciding who you bring back and who you don't at this time. With people you bring back, it's a good idea to give them a little bit of cross-training because they're probably going to have to do some things that they're not used to doing, and we want to make sure that they're prepared to do that effectively. And this is another thing where job descriptions come up, where I generally think it's a good idea to say in those descriptions, something to give you a little leeway, where generally these will be your job duties, but you may have additional duties from time to time as we need you to do them. Thinking about at-risk populations, I think is important here. Obviously, COVID-19 has hit different communities harder than others. We have people with immunity compromised conditions, older employees. These are things you want to keep in mind. Pregnant employees where they might be at higher risk. There's no right or wrong answer right now as to whether or not you bring these employees back at the same pace as others, but I think it's something you want to think about. If you have on the other side an employee who's already had COVID-19, do you consider them to be someone who should be brought back sooner? Maybe they have some immunity. We don't really know the answer to that yet. I'm certainly not a doctor, so I can't advise on that, but these are considerations as we continue through this. This will affect people in major cities differently than people who live in maybe rural or suburban areas. If you take public transportation to work, you might be in close quarters with other people if you're on a bus. So things to think about in keeping your employees safe. What do we do if somebody doesn't want to come back? Is just being afraid enough to keep somebody off of work? The general advice I've given at this point is it's probably not. But if you're able to let that person work from home a little bit longer and you're able to be flexible and they're able to get their job done, maybe it's something you want to consider. What do we do about our absenteeism policies? It sort of depends on what the language of your policy is, but if you have people who just aren't coming to work and aren't doing their job, that's going to be a problem. Obviously childcare is a consideration with schools being closed. How are we being flexible with our employees to let them take care of their families and stay safe, but still get the job done? These are all open questions. When we do bring people back, we want to make sure that they're as safe as we can keep them. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have given us some really helpful guidelines in this sense. It's a good idea to have any sort of markings you can in your office to show people where they're allowed to be, where they're not, how they can stay socially distanced. If you can it might be as simple as tape on the floor, or you might have some custom stickers that remind people to stay socially distant, to stay apart from each other. I think that's something I would advise. Anything that can divide people's workstations, be it cubicles or plexiglass or really just physical distance, is something that's advisable. But it really depends on how your workspace is set up. I know that some of you work for small businesses with very small workspaces, and it's difficult to physically separate people with distance. So you may have to come up with more creative solutions with dividers. Really, anything you can do to make sure you keep people as separate as possible. It's a good idea to require masks. And I wouldn't just require them, I would make some extras available. If somebody forgets their masks or claims they don't have access to them, if you have clients coming to your office, you want to make sure that they wear masks and to have some disposable masks available for them. And if an employee doesn't want to wear a mask, I think you need to ask yourself whether you're comfortable with that. This has sort of become a politicized issue, but really this is about safety. And I think if you want to keep your staff healthy and safe, and you want to protect everyone, it's the safest, most responsible thing at this point to require them. Sanitizer is a good idea, and making sure that people wash their hands. You might want to consider gloves. I think people are somewhat divided on whether gloves are all that helpful, but it's just another consideration to make people as safe as possible. We need to make sure that people aren't coming to work sick. Think about whether you want to take employee temperatures. It's not required. Most of the time, it wouldn't even be allowed. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission wouldn't allow it because it would be a health examination, and you're not usually allowed to do that. But they've made an exception during this pandemic because there is a direct threat to people's coworkers. But you can decide whether or not you want to take people's temperatures. If you do so, you should make sure that you pay your employees while they're waiting to have their temperature taken. You should make sure to keep the results of those temperatures as confidential as you can. You can ask employees questions. You can ask if they have any of the symptoms that have been associated with COVID-19. You can ask if they've been around anybody who's tested positive or shown symptoms. You can ask if they've traveled anywhere where we know that there's an outbreak. There are steps we can take aside from physical separation, staying 6 feet apart, to keep people in different places at different times. We can stagger people's work hours and sort of, rotate people through, where maybe some people work part-time from home and part-time in the office, and you try to mix those schedules up so that they don't interact very much. Or you start some people an hour earlier and other people an hour later to make sure that people aren't all coming in and out at the same time. Maybe you try to limit exposure people have to office equipment. You try to make sure people have their own office supplies and they're not sharing staplers or printers, things like that.
Hey, Doug, one of the things that's come up obviously in the recent week or so, of course, lots of folks seeing the coverage out of the Lake of the Ozarks on the holiday weekend and people not practicing social distancing and wearing masks, et cetera. Is it reasonable, is it okay, legal, that is to, when we ask employees certain questions, could we ask or add the question, and this would be obviously just generally speaking, not specific to that incident, as to whether anyone in their household might have been in a circumstance where they weren't practicing social distancing? I mean, I know that's so difficult to police, but is that a reasonable question to ask an employee? Is it within the bounds that the employer can do that?
It is reasonable, Barbara. Right now, I think employers have unprecedented leeway to ask whatever questions they need to, because this is a global pandemic. There is a direct threat to employees that makes this situation different from normal. I do think it's fine to ask those questions because, If you have a household member who's gone partying in a pool in Lake of the Ozarks and they come home, you're obviously at a higher risk, and therefore you're putting other people in your workplace at a higher risk. So I think that's definitely a question that is appropriate at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And one other question, picking up, just going back on the masks. A lot of employers, if to the extent they require the masks, the question is, should you require them to wear it anytime they're in the office, no matter where they're working? Or is it just maybe when, they're in a public area, if they're in their office with their door closed, is that okay? I realize some of this is going to be maybe common sense, but I assume it'd be okay to allow for, some exceptions, if you will, for the, when the mask might not need to be worn. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think you're right. I think this is largely a common sense question. Certainly, anytime you're in a public area and you're around people, I think you should wear it. If you're sitting in a private office with your door closed, nobody else is around you, I think you should use common sense. Is it safest to keep it on? Maybe so, but I think that's a reasonable case to take it off. I know if I were sitting in my own office with the door closed, I'd probably take my mask off. There is sort of a balancing act here between what is most responsible for those around us and for our own comfort and convenience. And, it's hard to wear a mask for 8 hours a day. But yeah, if you have a private space of your own and you're not really endangering anyone else, I think that's probably fine.
Great.
Just continuing in terms of ways to reduce risk in your workplace, I think to the extent you can keep clients and other visitors, family members, whoever it may be, out of your facility, that's a good idea for the time being. Just because the fewer people you have in your space, the better, because every time someone new comes in, you're introducing a new person who's been exposed to different people in different situations, and it adds to the risk for everybody. I think it's a good idea to limit things like handshakes. Keep people distant. Let's not touch each other if we can help it. Excuse me. Things like communal kitchens and break areas. I would discourage those for the time being because they're areas where people tend to congregate in a close space. They tend to touch the same things. So I'd probably turn off things like the coffee maker and the ice machine and just tell people to, bring their own stuff. If you need to bring a cup of coffee or a cooler with your lunch in it, so be it. It's an inconvenience, but it's eliminating another place where there's a lot of physical contact. I would make sure that those areas get cleaned frequently, whether you're using them or not. And if you do have to use those areas, I would make sure that you spread everything out as far as you can to maintain social distance, that you try to stagger people's lunch times and break times, really just to limit interaction as much as you can. If you can get rid of things like printed materials and you can keep everything virtual, I think that's a good idea just because it's one more type of surface that you don't have people touching. If you need to have meetings, I think it's a great time, whether you're in the office or telecommuting, to try to do them on Zoom or some other form of video chat rather than get people in a conference room together, just because that's too many people in a close space. As we've touched on before, let's try to make sure people have their own supplies. They're not sharing common pens or staplers. Let's make sure everything gets cleaned. I think normally everybody wants to make sure their offices are relatively clean, but we have to go the extra mile right now, make sure things are disinfected regularly. Everybody's being told to wash their hands frequently, to cover their mouths when they're coughing. This is a good time to maybe encourage people with some signage and just remind them, hey, we're in unusual times. Please go the extra mile and wash your hands for 20 seconds. Use sanitizer around the office. If you have outside janitorial services, You might want to verify what steps they're taking to make sure that they're cleaning everything effectively. If you have the sort of office space where you're changing your own air filters, you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate filters and that you're getting those changed. Really just anything that can reduce the possibility of spreading this is going to keep people safe. Now we need to think about the worst case scenario when someone in your office does test positive. You want to, first of all, I think it goes without saying, you want to make sure that you keep them apart from other people because you don't want to spread this. Would send them home if they're able to go home safely. And if for some reason they're unable to drive or otherwise get home, to make sure that they stay as isolated as possible. Confidentiality is tricky because you're going to want to make sure people know that there's an elevated risk in the office, but you also need to make sure you're staying confidential with someone's confidential medical information. You don't want to say, hey, Joe has coronavirus. Everybody stay away from Joe, because that's really kind of violating his privacy. But at the same time, you do want to make sure everybody stays safe, and they may notice that Joe isn't at work for the next 2 weeks, so they may have an idea, but that doesn't mean you need to go around saying, hey, Joe has this. So be as confidential as possible. We're not really there with contact tracing all the way, but to the extent you can figure out who an infected person has worked near or been close to, you might want to keep an eye on them and just make sure they're not showing any symptoms over the next couple of weeks. If you have an outbreak in your office, I would consider closing the office and returning to remote work for a few weeks while everything gets cleaned and everybody has a chance to quarantine. You want to make sure you communicate with employees. Hey, if you're sick, stay home. Don't come to the office. We'll be flexible with you if we need to, but don't risk other people's health, and don't risk your own health by coming in when you shouldn't. And we want to make clear what people need to do when they are ready to return to work. Make sure that they get tested and that they're not sick anymore, that they're not showing any more symptoms, and that they're ready to safely return. In terms of travel and visitors, I think this is where I want to reiterate, it's the safest to stay remote as much as you can. If you can avoid sending employees out to interact with other people and to go to other places and other markets, you're keeping them and everyone in your office safer. If you can limit the number of visitors that come into your workplace, again, you're just limiting the risk of spreading this by having new people introduced. I think if you do have visitors in your office, you should consider whether you have them sign liability waivers. You don't want somebody down the line to claim that they got sick because they visited your office and try to blame your business for that. I think, you should talk to your clients though and make sure that, they understand why you're taking these steps, figure out if they have any preferences for maintaining their own safety, and if you could work together in ways such as having video conferences instead of in-person meetings, then you might be doing something that keeps you safe and keeps them safe and happy.
Well, thanks, Doug. So far, we've got a lot of really great questions, and needless to say, as we would expect, as this issue is just ongoing, the questions will continue, and hopefully you're not overwhelmed, but feel empowered with some of the recommendations that we've said today. On the liability waiver, and I know we'll talk about this in just a little bit, certainly there's a concern as to the employer's liability if another employee tests positive. And I know you spoke to the contact tracing element and the confidentiality element of that too. What if an employee were to get sick? So someone who was in contact with that person, and we've let them know, and then they are to get sick. Would that be a workers' comp issue for that employer potentially, or could they hire their own plaintiff's lawyer and decide they want to sue the organization? what are your thoughts on that?
This is sort of one of these issues that we'll see as we go, because this is all brand new. The way I would interpret this, that is a workers' comp issue. If somebody gets sick while they're in the process of doing their job, that's classically something that is covered by workers' comp. Typically, they would not be able to bring some sort of other lawsuit because it would be preempted by the workers' comp law. Now, if somebody tried to bring some sort of lawsuit against their employer claiming they were forced to work in an unsafe workplace or something along those lines, I think the best defense you have is to take steps to keep people safe, to show all the precautions that you've taken, to show people all the cleaning and the social distancing you've done, and the efforts you've taken to let people work from home if they are immunocompromised or of a vulnerable age. Any of these steps you take now are things that will help you down the road, because you can't absolutely prevent everybody from getting this virus, but you can show that you've taken the reasonable steps necessary to keep people as safe as possible. And at the end of the day, that's really all you can do. You can never prevent every last possible situation, but you could just be as prepared as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really a good comment. I think we all know that, and we all practice that with our clients, and you all do with your clients as well, as to how, risk tolerant are they? And again, we're in uncharted waters here, no doubt. When it comes, I think, to things, we've had questions, Doug, about, if people are working in cubicles, in open space, certainly the recommendations as to staggering cubicles, if you can, that type of thing, I think is good. You mentioned the kitchen strategy, which I smile and say that because in our office, we is preparing for a return to work at some point, is the kitchen's going to be closed, no coffee. And of course, for a group of lawyers, that just, strikes fear in us as we sip our own coffee. But, if folks go out, obviously then they have risk too, at bringing back, I suppose what they got at the next place. So yeah, I think the common sense piece makes a lot of sense as well. And then, on the fever check, the temperature check, would it be all right? So if the CDC has that 104 or 100 degrees 0.4, would it be okay if the business were to say lower, like 99.6 or even 100, and also ask whether that person has taken a fever reducer? Would that be all right to ask that an employee that question?
Yeah, you can ask the question. And yeah, the 100.4 is the CDC guidance. It's sort of commonly considered best practices, but I don't see a problem with being more conservative than that. You're really just trying to keep people safe. And, if you want to set it at 99 or 100 or something a little bit lower, I don't see a problem with that. This is a time where, we're in a threat, and we're taking steps we can to keep people safe. And especially if you're telling people to stay home and they're still able to work remotely, because really at that point, there's no adverse action to them. They're not losing a day's pay because they had to go home. They are just going home to work remotely. So whenever possible, I'll just keep harping on this, if you can have people work remotely, it's a good idea. But yeah, I think you can definitely be conservative with those temperatures.
Yeah, and one last question, then we get in the home stretch, Doug, about sick pay and vacation leave time in this. If someone was exposed, what would the employer do? I mean, if they obviously want them to self-quarantine, I suppose to the extent they could work remotely, they could continue to do that. But I know there's been a lot of different employers changing their policies. What are your recommendations on the sick leave, vacation, PTO, in terms of how it might interact, or sort of the intersection, if you will, with the COVID pandemic?
Sure. And, it's a complicated question because there are a lot of variables here. If you look at the legislation, the federal legislation that passed, the Families First Coronavirus Recovery Act, if you are sick, you might be eligible to get partial pay while you're at home. depending on the size of the employer. If you have fewer than 500 employees, but more than 50, then your employees might be eligible for some degree of pay while they're at home because they're sick or quarantined or someone in their home is sick. But if you're smaller than that, you likely will not have to pay on that. If depending on what county or city or state you're in, you may have different requirements regarding paid sick leave. So, some of that's going to be specific to where you're operating. If people have vacation, paid time off available, I think it's generally a good idea to let them use that rather than have to stay home without pay. It's good for the employees, obviously, because they're getting paid, and it's not a problem for employers because they're running down their allotment. So you're still kind of within your budget there. But yeah, I think it somewhat depends on where you are and what size employer you are.
Great. Well, thanks, Doug. I know we're in the home stretch, and please keep asking the questions in the queue. And, I know there's a lot of talk and uncertainty, and that's what we're all dealing with, Doug, the potential of the second wave and how that might impact an employer that has started to bring people back. And then all of a sudden, similar to how we all had to sort of almost immediately jump back, we may have to do that again. What are your thoughts and recommendations on that?
Yeah, one thing that worries me is I hear a lot of people who are under the mindset that as we open back up and we bring people back to work, that this is over and like we're back to normal. We don't have to think about it. The problem is we've already seen different countries around the world have a second spike of this. And it's entirely possible that in the next few weeks, months, who knows, it might be 6 months down the road, but we might get another wave of this that's as bad or worse than the first. And we have to start preparing for that now. The first thing I think you need to do, you need to be honest with people. You need to be communicative with them. You need to make sure that they know what this, we're planning for all eventualities. There may be a time when we have to change the way things are. It's business as usual to some degree right now, but it may not stay that way. We may have to send some of you back home to work. We may need to lay some of you off. We may need to change the social distancing guidelines we have in place if this continues to be a problem and if it gets worse. I think you need to keep reminding people what they can do to stay safe. They need to keep washing their hands. They need to wear their masks. They need to stay apart. I think we need to remind people as this goes on, if you have an employee assistance program to use that. This is a really stressful time and it's been hard on people, and let's make sure that they know there are resources there to help them if you have those resources. But it's a good idea to think through these issues ahead of time and sort of have some talking points ready to share with your employees when, if and when these problems happen. One thing that has been an issue so far with COVID-19 and maybe an issue again in the future is whether you have to let employees go. Not everybody is going to be able to work from home, and if you can't be in the office, they might have to be laid off, or you may not have enough business to support them. A common question I have gotten from almost everybody is, what's the difference between a layoff and a furlough, and what should I call this? Don't worry too much about what you call it. Essentially, they're the same thing. You're telling someone they're not going to be working and they're not going to be getting paid. That's the big thing. A furlough was usually thought of as being somewhat temporary, and you're keeping them on your payroll, but they're just they're off of work for the time being. A layoff might be more open-ended or it might be more permanent, but it doesn't really matter. The big picture is they're not working, they're not getting paid. When you're laying people off, and we've touched on this before, but make sure you have a good reason why you're making the decisions you make, because this is going to be a time we get a lot of discrimination claims. I got laid off, but this person didn't, and it's because of my, fill in the blank protected class. You want to make sure that you've really examined what people do and why you're making the decisions you're making, why one job might be more appropriate for layoff than another. You want to have these in place so that if you do get these discrimination claims, you have an answer for it. You need to think about things like whether you're covered by the WARN Act, whether you're a large enough employer that that's going to impact you or not, whether you're laying off enough employees that it'll impact you. You need to think about whether you're going to offer people separation pay. You can do that so that they release any claims that they might have against you. So hopefully we don't get those discrimination claims. You can do it to kind of help them have a softer landing after they lose their job. It might just kind of make everybody feel a little bit better since they're not going to have their job. Thing to remember, if you have workers over 40, you need to make sure that you give them the proper information when you offer them a separation package in exchange for a release. They're entitled to a little bit more time to consider your offer. They may be entitled to information about which people are getting laid off and which people aren't.
Doug, we had a question come in with regard to furloughs.
Sure.
In a furlough situation, does the employer have to provide, or I guess depending on how they set it up, 100% of their employer and employee benefits during a furlough period? How does that work?
You generally don't have to. And we've seen employers who are providing full benefits during furloughs. We've seen other employers who are providing no benefits. This is really something that's probably dependent on the terms of your plans. So you'll want to speak to your insurance provider and to go through your summary plan description and make sure that you're following your rules, because every plan's different, and you just want to be careful that you're not breaking those rules. But there's nothing aside from those plans that typically requires you to pay those benefits while somebody's off work. Let's just think of a few more of the considerations we have during these times where people are sick or maybe they're being laid off. It is likely that you're going to see a rise in workers' compensation claims. People claim they got sick while they were doing their job. They're probably going to file. So you're probably going to have to deal with more of these claims. I think, we've already seen that unemployment claims have been through the roof. Different states' unemployment offices are working around the clock and they still can't keep up with the demand. This is just an unprecedented time. We may see more OSHA claims, people trying to claim that you didn't keep a safe workplace. Another reason to make sure you take all the steps possible to follow the CDC's guidance and to make sure that your workplace is as safe as possible. We should talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and reasonable accommodations. You'll probably have some people who come to you and say maybe they can't return to the office because they're immunocompromised. This is a time where you really have to work with people, and you have to go through the interactive process, and you have to see if there's a way you can accommodate them. Doesn't necessarily mean they can stay off of work or that they can work from home indefinitely, but maybe you have to find something that allows them to work different hours or to have different protective equipment or something you can do that's reasonable that lets employees do their job. But that's something that you have to talk through with employees. You might need a doctor's note, but it's really no different from any other accommodation issue. As we already touched on, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, you need to make sure you have the required notice posted in your workplace as you go back. Even if you're exempt from the act, you still have to post that. You need to make sure that you're giving people leave when they're entitled to it. And there are a number of different scenarios when people are entitled to paid leave, and it's kind of a case-by-case basis. So, that's something we can touch on as necessary. But that's really all I intended to talk about today. But if you visit the Barnes and Thornburg website, we have a number of resources available for different employers. So we invite you to check these resources out and sign up for updates. And we're happy to continue to take any questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. And one thing on our website I'll call your attention to, and I mentioned this at the outset with regard to the states, Missouri borders, we have a COVID-19 tracker. So that is a clearinghouse, a database that we update on a daily basis of all of the federal, state, local, county, city executive orders impacting everything from staying at home to gatherings to labor and employment issues, things like that. So if you want to search for a particular city or state, there's a resource to do that. I wanted to ask you, Doug, you just mentioned on the Families First Act that even the employers who are exempt, so those under 50, that there is a required notice. Is there a resource, a link to that? I don't know if it's on our site, I should know that. Or is there a link where folks can see that required notice that they might need to post?
Yeah, the Department of Labor definitely has a link to that. And when I've shared this with my clients, I've directed them straight there, because really it's as simple as you can print out the notice they have, hang it on your bulletin board, or put it in a PDF and email it to all of your employees. That's the most direct way to find it. We probably do have it on our website as well. I've not gone there directly to get it, just because I've gotten it from the DOL. But yeah, it's pretty easy to find. Just FFCRA, notice, and you should find it from the Department of Labor pretty easily.
Okay, thanks. And I know we're going to have some resource materials for the folks after with the slides, and so we can include that link as well. We're coming into vacation season normally, which is going to look a lot different. Doug, do you have recommendations for employers if an employee takes vacation time to go to a particular locale? When they come back from vacation, is it okay to have a policy that says they might need to self-quarantine? What are your thoughts on that? Is it more of a common sense situation, or should employers consider having a policy again, during this period of uncertainty?
I think it's a fine idea to consider something like that. It's going to be a little bit common sense. If you have somebody travel to a different continent, you're going to treat that differently than if they travel to Illinois. But I do think you need to take some common sense steps where if somebody's going to a hotspot area, you might ask them to work from home for 2 weeks. Or if they can't work from home, then figure out whether they take some paid leave or unpaid leave if necessary. I think those are definitely reasonable steps.
Good. Yeah, that's definitely something. And, questions again with regard to furlough and layoff. And I know, you and I talk about these often. I guess in a layoff scenario, is it fair to say that, I would think of that akin as a termination with the potential of a rehiring at some point, as opposed to a furlough where it may be for a specific period of time? Is that a proper way to think about it? Because I know these words are often used interchangeably, and I know it gives a lot of folks heartburn on that. And needless to say, it obviously gives the employees heartburn in terms of how it's presented to them. And, I know you talked specifically, which, I can't say enough of agreeing with you on the soft landing approach. And I know many of you are already doing that if you've had to lay folks off. But what are your thoughts, Doug, on distinguishing between that, the layoff versus the furlough?
I think it's hard because everybody uses these terms to suit their own interests. A lot of people like to say furlough because it sounds softer than a layoff, and layoff sounds softer than termination. Oftentimes it means the same thing. We've had furloughs where people thought it would be for 2 weeks and it ended up being permanent. We've had layoffs where people thought it would be permanent and it ended up being for a shorter period of time. Generally, I think the terms are largely interchangeable. And I think, it's somewhat spin to use one term versus the other, but I would treat all of them you know, to mean basically the same thing, but be honest and communicative with people. If you think that this is going to be a short-term situation, tell them that that's what you think. If you think it's likely to be permanent or indefinite, tell them that. And tell them that, you know, situations can change. Just because you tell someone you think it'll be for a month or less doesn't mean it will be. We don't know how this is all going to play out. But I think to the extent you can give people realistic expectations, that's the best thing you can do for them. Because if they need to start looking for other work, then they should do so with the expectation that their job may not be there for them.
Yeah, and I know that in that regard, there's a lot of, again, guidance and consternation. Many of you may be advising your clients on the CARES Act and some of the funding and the PPP program for payroll and some of the requirements there. And then further consternation when it came out, you know, as to audits of how money's used and all the rest. So I know that that's something that also could impact that furlough, you know, situation in terms of bringing people back on as well. We do have as well, just plug on our website, some information on the CARES Act too. As you all know, it's ever evolving and something that we're all needing to keep posted on, you know, for ourselves, obviously, and for our clients as well. And then I guess the last point here, a lot of you and your staff are working on a new tax deadline with July 15th. And you know, as Doug and I were chatting in advance of this program, thinking about how you, I'm sure all are accustomed with your teams of, you know, being in the office 24/7 around that time and closely together. And obviously for the reasons, you know, that we've all talked about, needing to rethink how that would happen in a safe way, you know, will be important. And, you know, I like the concept that you said as well. Many of you have such good relationships and personal contact with your clients, as we're fortunate to do, and face-to-face and having them stop by is an important thing. And here again, I think that's another element that, you know, that people should have an expectation on that, whether it's not to come to the office or if you are to come, you know, here are some protocols. So, you know, I think it's something that's been, we've been accustomed to living with. But Doug, I'll let you have the last word here and any final closing remarks. And I'll just add my thanks as well to our good friends at Missouri CPA Society, all of the members listening today, all the folks who sponsor, you know, the programs. We very much appreciate it. Happy to be a continued resource. Doug?
I just want to thank everybody for listening to me. That's a long time to listen to me prattle on, but stay safe out there, be responsible. I know we all want to get back to the office and be as productive as we can, but let's balance the needs to, you know, be productive with the need to keep everybody safe. And if you have any questions, my email's on the screen. Don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll help you as much as we can.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Barbara. Really appreciate you taking your time to be with us today. But in the interest of time, that concludes today's program. I'd like to thank Doug and Barbara one more time for sharing their thoughts with us today. I encourage all of you to continue to check out our website for additional information and learning opportunities. And I hope you joined today's program and have a great weekend.